Margaret found withdrawal slips in her dead husband's desk. $500. Every Tuesday. For 40 years. Over $1 million. Gone. She thought she knew him. She thought they'd built their life on honesty. But when she walked into that bank and asked where the money went, the teller's face went pale. What she discovered next didn't just shatter her marriage. It exposed a secret that destroyed a man's life decades ago. Welcome back, my family. Before we begin, I want to take a moment for anyone who's ever been betrayed, dismissed, or made to feel small. May you find strength without losing your softness. May justice find you without hardening your heart. And may every tear you've cried in silence become wisdom, not bitterness. This space is for healing, truth, and growth. If this speaks to you, tell me in the comments, what lesson did pain teach you? Margaret Hayes sat on the floor of her late husband's study, surrounded by 42 years of a life she thought she knew. Bankers' boxes lined the walls. Filing cabinets stood open like mouths caught mid-scream. Papers covered every surface. Tax returns, mortgage documents, insurance policies. The house in Bolton Hill had never felt this quiet. Richard had only been gone 3 weeks, but the silence had a weight to it now, pressing down on her chest every time she walked past his empty chair. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to make sense of the mess. Trying to stay busy. Trying not to think about the fact that she'd kissed him goodbye on a Tuesday morning in March and he'd collapsed in the Chesapeake Trust parking lot 2 hours later. Dead before the ambulance arrived. That's what the doctor said. Massive heart attack. Nothing anyone could have done. Margaret pulled another folder from the cabinet. Estate planning documents. She'd already been through most of this with the lawyer. The will was straightforward. The house was paid off. Richard had been careful, methodical. He always was. But then she saw it. A small accordion file tucked in the back of the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old performance reviews. The tab read, Personal, Private. She hesitated. Richard had never kept anything from her. Not in 4 decades of marriage. They'd built a life on honesty, on quiet trust. He told her everything. Didn't he? Margaret pulled the file out and set it on the desk. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know why. Inside were withdrawal slips. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. All from the same branch, Chesapeake Trust on North Charles Street. All for the same amount. $500. Cash. Every single Tuesday. Going back to 1984. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She spread the slips across the desk, her fingers moving faster now, searching for something that made sense. A pattern. A note. An explanation. Nothing. Just decades of identical transactions. 40 years of Tuesdays. 40 years of Richard walking into that branch and walking out with $500 in cash. She did the math in her head. 52 weeks a year. 40 years. Over $1 million. Gone. Margaret sat back in the chair, staring at the slips like they were written in a language she didn't speak. Her mind raced through possibilities. An affair. Blackmail. Gambling. No. Richard didn't gamble. He barely drank. He went to church every Sunday and read the Baltimore Sun with his coffee every morning. He was careful. Predictable. Boring, even. But this was something else. Margaret picked up one of the slips. The date was from last month. February 13th, 2024. 2 weeks before he died. She could picture him that morning. Khakis, blue sweater, his reading glasses tucked into his pocket. He'd kissed her on the forehead like he always did. Branch business, he'd said. Branch business. For 40 years. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the bank's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. What was she going to say? My husband's been taking out $500 every week for 4 decades, and I have no idea why. It sounded insane. But she pressed the button anyway. The line rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. Chesapeake Trust and Savings, North Charles Street Branch. How can I help you? Margaret's voice came out steadier than she expected. Hi. My name is Margaret Hayes. My husband, Richard Hayes, passed away recently. He was a senior vice president with the bank. Oh. The voice softened immediately. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hayes. Thank you. I'm going through his records and I found some discrepancies. Withdrawal slips. A lot of them. I was wondering if I could come in and speak with someone about his account activity. There was a pause. Of course. When would you like to come in? Tomorrow, Margaret said. First thing. She hung up before the woman could respond. Margaret sat there in the dim light of the study, staring at the slips spread across the desk like evidence of a crime she didn't understand. Richard had been her husband for 42 years. They'd raised no children, couldn't after the miscarriage in '86, but they'd built a life. A good life. Quiet dinners. Weekend trips to Annapolis. 42 years of knowing someone so well you could finish their sentences. And now she didn't know him at all. She picked up the most recent slip and held it up to the light. What were you doing, Richard? She whispered. The house didn't answer. But tomorrow she'd find out. If you've ever discovered something that changed everything you thought you knew, something that made you question every memory, every moment, you'll understand what Margaret is about to face. Stay with me. Because what she finds at that bank will shatter everything. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Richard's side of the mattress cold and untouched, her mind cycling through every Tuesday for the past 40 years. Had there been signs? Something she missed. She thought about the routine. How he'd leave the house at 9:30 a.m., always in business casual, even though he didn't need to dress up for branch business. How he'd return around noon, sometimes with lunch from the deli on St. Paul Street. How he'd kiss her cheek and say, all done, like he'd just finished something ordinary. All done. What had he been doing? By the time the sun came up, Margaret had convinced herself of a dozen different scenarios. None of them made sense. All of them terrified her. She dressed carefully that morning. Navy slacks, a cream blouse, her good coat. She wanted to look composed. In control. Like a woman who had answers, not questions. The drive to North Charles Street took 15 minutes. She'd been to this branch before, years ago, back when Richard first started at Chesapeake Trust. It was an old building, tall windows and marble floors, the kind of place that still felt like banking meant something. Margaret parked across the street and sat in her car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. You don't have to do this, a voice whispered in her head. You could just let it go. Whatever it is, he's gone. It doesn't matter anymore. But it did matter. She grabbed her purse and walked inside. The lobby was nearly empty. A young black woman stood behind the teller counter, typing something into her computer. She looked up when Margaret approached and smiled. Good morning. How can I help you? Margaret set her purse on the counter. My name is Margaret Hayes. I called yesterday about my husband's account. Richard Hayes. The smile faltered. Just for a second. But Margaret saw it. The teller's fingers froze on the keyboard. Her eyes widened slightly, then dropped. Oh, yes. Mrs. Hayes. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you. Margaret kept her voice steady. I need to speak with someone about his account activity. Specifically, cash withdrawals he made over the years. The teller nodded slowly. Let me get the branch manager for you. Just one moment. She disappeared into a back office, moving faster than necessary. Margaret stood there, her pulse quickening. That reaction, that look. The teller knew something. A moment later, a white man in his 50s emerged from the office, his hand extended. Mrs. Hayes. I'm David Brennan, branch manager. Please, come with me. He led her to a small conference room with a glass table and uncomfortable chairs. He closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit. First, let me say how deeply sorry we all are about Richard's passing. He was a giant in this organization, a mentor to so many of us. Thank you. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Mr. Brennan, I'll be direct. I found withdrawal slips in my husband's files. Cash withdrawals. $500. Every Tuesday. For 40 years. Brennan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. I see. Do you? Margaret leaned forward. Because I don't. I don't see why my husband would need to withdraw that much cash, that consistently, for that long. And I don't see why no one at this bank ever questioned it. Brennan cleared his throat. Mrs. Hayes, I understand your concern. But your husband was a senior executive. He had full autonomy over his accounts. It wasn't our place to. I'm not asking whose place it was. Margaret's voice was sharper now. I'm asking what he was doing with the money. Brennan hesitated. I'm afraid I don't have that information. Then find someone who does. They stared at each other across the table. Finally, Brennan nodded. Let me pull up his transaction history. It may take a few minutes. He left the room. Margaret sat alone in the silence, her heart pounding. She could feel it now, the truth, whatever it was, hiding just beneath the surface, close enough to touch. The door opened, but it wasn't Brennan. It was the young teller from earlier. She stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind her, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid of being seen. Mrs. Hayes. Margaret stood. Yes. The woman's name tag read Shanice. Shanice took a breath. I'm not supposed to be in here. But I heard what you were asking about, and She stopped, struggling with something. I think you should know. Your husband. He didn't just come in for withdrawals. Margaret's chest tightened. What do you mean? He came every Tuesday. 4 years. I've only been here 3 years, but the older staff, they all knew him. And he didn't just take the money and leave. Shanice's voice dropped to a whisper. He always asked for the same person. Who? Her name was Claire. Claire Dalton. She worked in client services for almost 30 years. She retired about 6 months ago. Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her. Why did he ask for her? Shanice shook her head. I don't know. But every Tuesday, like clockwork, he'd come in, withdraw the cash, and meet with her in one of the private offices. They'd be in there for maybe 10, 15 minutes. Then he'd leave. What did they talk about? No one knows. Claire never said. And your husband never said. But, Shanice hesitated. Mrs. Hayes, I don't want to upset you. But people noticed. They talked. Some of them thought. Well, they thought maybe it was personal. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Personal. I'm just telling you what I heard. The door opened again. Brennan stepped in, his expression tight. Shanice, you're needed at the counter. Shanice nodded quickly and slipped past him, avoiding Margaret's eyes. Brennan held up a folder. I have the transaction records you requested. Margaret didn't move. Who is Claire Dalton? Brennan's jaw tightened. A former employee. Where is she now? Mrs. Hayes, I really don't think. Where is she? Brennan sighed. He opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the table. It was Claire Dalton's retirement paperwork. Address included. Towson. 20 minutes away. Margaret picked up the paper and stood. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Mrs. Hayes, please. Whatever you think this is. But she was already walking toward the door. She didn't look back. Margaret sat in her car outside the bank for 10 minutes, staring at the address on the paper. Claire Dalton. 428 Overbrook Road, Towson. A name she'd never heard. A woman her husband met with every Tuesday for decades. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to call someone. Her sister in Atlanta. Her best friend, Diane. Someone who could tell her this was all a misunderstanding. That there was a reasonable explanation. But she didn't. Because deep down she knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't reasonable. Margaret started the car and pulled out onto North Charles Street, heading north toward Towson. The drive was a blur. She barely registered the traffic, the stoplights, the gray March sky pressing down on the city. Her mind kept circling back to the same question. Who was Claire Dalton to Richard? An affair seemed obvious. Too obvious. Richard wasn't the type. He'd loved her. She knew he'd loved her. 42 years didn't lie. But then again, 40 years of secret withdrawals didn't lie either. Overbrook Road was a quiet street lined with small brick houses and bare trees. Margaret pulled up to number 428 and cut the engine. The house was modest. Well kept. A small front porch with a rocking chair. A bird feeder hanging from a maple tree in the yard. It looked normal. Margaret got out of the car and walked up the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch and stood in front of the door, her finger hovering over the doorbell. "You can still leave," the voice whispered again. "You don't have to know." She pressed the button. A dog barked inside. Footsteps approached. The door opened. The woman standing there was white, maybe in her late 60s, with short silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She wore jeans and a faded Oriole sweatshirt. She looked at Margaret with polite confusion. "Can I help you?" Margaret's throat was dry. "Are you Claire Dalton?" "Yes." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do I know you?" "No." "But you knew my husband." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "Richard Hayes." Claire's face went pale. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The dog, a small terrier, poked its head around Claire's leg, tail wagging. Claire gripped the doorframe. "Oh God! I need to talk to you," Margaret said quietly. Claire shook her head, backing up a step. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't help you. Please." Margaret's voice cracked. "He's gone. He died 3 weeks ago. And I found the withdrawal slips. 40 years of them. I know he came to see you every Tuesday. I know he was giving you money. I just need to understand why." Claire's eyes filled with tears. She looked away, her hand still clutching the door like it was the only thing holding her up. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm so sorry about Richard. He was a good man. But I can't. Can't or won't." Claire flinched. Margaret took a step closer. "I've been married to that man since 1982. I loved him. I buried him. And now I'm standing here realizing I didn't know him at all. So please, please, tell me what he was doing." Claire closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. "He was paying for something," she whispered. Margaret's heart stopped. "What?" "He was paying for something he did. A long time ago." "What did he do?" Claire opened her eyes. They were full of pain. "I can't tell you. It's not my story to tell." "Then whose story is it?" Claire hesitated. Then she turned, disappeared into the house for a moment, and returned with a small piece of paper. She held it out to Margaret with a shaking hand. "If you want the truth, go there." "But Mrs. Hayes," Claire's voice broke, "maybe you shouldn't. Maybe some things are better left alone." Margaret took the paper. It was an address. West Baltimore. A neighborhood she didn't know. "Who lives there?" Margaret asked. Claire wiped her eyes. "The person your husband hurt." Margaret sat in her car outside Claire's house, staring at the address written in neat handwriting. 2247, Pressbury Street. West Baltimore. The person Richard hurt. Her mind reeled. Richard had never hurt anyone. He was careful, methodical, kind. He mentored young bankers. He donated to the church. He'd held her hand through her mother's funeral and never once complained when she cried herself to sleep for months afterward. He wasn't a man who hurt people. But Claire's words echoed in her head. He was paying for something he did. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Diane. Thinking of you. Lunch this week? She didn't respond. Instead, she typed the address into her GPS. 23 minutes away. Margaret started the car and pulled onto the road, heading south. The neighborhoods changed as she drove, from the neat lawns of Towson to the narrow row houses of the city. The buildings grew older. The streets grew quieter. Pressbury Street was lined with brick row houses, most of them narrow and worn. Some had painted stoops. Others had bars on the windows. A group of kids played basketball in the street, their laughter echoing off the buildings. Margaret parked in front of 2247 and turned off the engine. The house was small, 2 stories, with a green-painted door and white curtains in the windows. A small garden bed sat beneath the front window, empty now but clearly tended. She sat there for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The person your husband hurt. Margaret got out of the car and walked up to the door. Her legs felt weak. Her heart pounded in her ears. She knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The door opened. An elderly black woman stood in the doorway. She was small, maybe 5'2", with silver hair pulled back in a bun and deep lines etched into her face. She wore a floral dress and a cardigan, and she looked at Margaret with eyes that had seen too much. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman's face crumpled. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, you're Richard's wife." Margaret's breath caught. "How did you? You look like the picture he showed me." The woman's voice was soft, trembling. "Years ago. He showed me a picture of you both at your wedding." Margaret felt the ground tilt beneath her. The woman stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in, child. You've come a long way for the truth. Might as well hear it." Margaret walked inside. The house was small but immaculate. Hardwood floors, lace doilies on the side tables, and covering the walls, photographs. Dozens of them. A young black man in a cap and gown, smiling wide. The same man in a military uniform, standing tall and proud. The man holding a baby, his face full of joy. Margaret stopped in front of the largest photo. The man looked to be in his 20s, standing in front of a building she recognized. Chesapeake Trust. The woman stood beside her, looking at the photo with an expression Margaret couldn't name. "That's my son," she said quietly. "Daniel." Margaret turned to her. "What happened to him?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Your husband happened to him." What do you think Richard did to Daniel? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what Margaret is about to learn will change everything. Margaret stood frozen in the small living room, staring at the photograph of the young man, Daniel, smiling in front of Chesapeake Trust. The woman gestured toward a worn floral couch. "Sit down, Mrs. Hayes. Please." Margaret sat, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield. The woman lowered herself into a rocking chair across from her, moving slowly, like her bones hurt. "My name is Lorraine," the woman said. "Lorraine Grant." "Mrs. Grant, Margaret's voice failed her. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know what question to ask first. Lorraine saved her the trouble. "You found the withdrawal slips," she said quietly. "That's why you're here." Margaret nodded. Lorraine looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "I told him not to do it. Told him I didn't want his money. But he wouldn't listen. Every Tuesday for 40 years. Like clockwork." She looked up, her eyes glistening. "He said it was the least he could do." The least he could do for what? Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. Lorraine stood slowly and walked to a small bookshelf in the corner. She pulled down a photo album, the kind with the plastic sleeves, and brought it back to the couch. She sat beside Margaret and opened it. The first page showed a baby. A beautiful black baby with bright eyes and a toothless grin. "That's Daniel," Lorraine said, her finger tracing the edge of the photo. "Born February 14th, 1962. Valentine's Day baby. Sweetest child you ever met." She turned the page. Daniel as a boy. Daniel on a bicycle. Daniel at a birthday party, cake smeared on his face. He was smart. So smart. Made honor roll every year. Got a scholarship to Morgan State. She turned another page. Daniel in his cap and gown, the same photo from the wall. Graduated in 1984 with a degree in finance. Top of his class. Margaret's chest tightened. Lorraine turned the page again. Daniel in a suit, standing in front of Chesapeake Trust, his face full of pride and hope. He got a job at the bank right out of college. Started as a teller. Said he was going to work his way up. Be a manager someday. Make something of himself. Lorraine's voice cracked. He was there 6 months. Margaret felt ice spreading through her veins. Lorraine closed the album and set it on her lap, her hands shaking. It was November 1984. The bank was cutting costs. Laying people off. Your husband, he was a manager then. Young. Maybe 28, 29. He was under pressure from the executives. They wanted him to find a reason to let people go. Make it look justified. Margaret's stomach twisted. Daniel was one of the newest hires. Didn't have seniority. Didn't have protection. Lorraine's voice was barely audible now. Your husband accused him of stealing from the cash drawer. Said the drawer came up short 3 times in 2 weeks. Said Daniel was the only one with access. No, Margaret whispered. Daniel swore he didn't do it. Begged them to check the cameras, to investigate. But there were no cameras back then. No real oversight. It was Richard's word against a 22-year-old black kid fresh out of college. Lorraine looked at Margaret, tears streaming down her face. Who do you think they believed? Margaret couldn't breathe. They fired him. And they didn't just fire him, they called the police. Pressed charges. Said they had to make an example of him. Oh God, Margaret breathed. Daniel was arrested. It made the papers. Bank teller arrested for theft. His name. His face. Everyone saw it. His fiancée left him. Said she couldn't be with a thief. His friends stopped calling. Doors closed everywhere he turned. Lorraine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. The charges were eventually dropped. Not enough evidence. But it didn't matter. His name was ruined. No bank would hire him. No company would take a chance on him. He ended up working construction. Odd jobs. Anything he could get. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the nausea rising in her throat. Lorraine turned back to her. He started drinking. Got depressed. I tried to help him, but... Her voice broke. He was drowning. And I couldn't pull him out. Mrs. Grant. He died in 1991, Lorraine said, her voice flat now, emptied of emotion. Took his own life. Hung himself in his apartment on a Tuesday night. The landlord found him 3 days later. The room spun. Margaret stood, her legs shaking. I'm so sorry. I'm so... Your husband came to see me 2 weeks after the funeral, Lorraine continued, as if Margaret hadn't spoken. Showed up at my door, just like you did today. He was crying. Said he couldn't live with what he'd done. Said Daniel was innocent. That he'd lied about the theft to cover the layoffs. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. I screamed at him. Told him to get out. Told him his confession didn't bring my son back. Lorraine's voice hardened. But he kept coming. Every week. Then every month. Then he stopped coming in person and started sending money through that woman at the bank. Claire. How much? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. $500. Every week. For 40 years. Lorraine looked at her. Over $1 million. Margaret sank back onto the couch, her head in her hands. I didn't want it at first, Lorraine said quietly. Threw the first few checks away. But then I thought, maybe Daniel would have wanted me to take it. Use it for something good. So I did. I set up a scholarship fund at Morgan State. In Daniel's name. Every penny your husband sent me went into that fund. Margaret looked up, tears blurring her vision. 32 students have gotten their degrees because of that money, Lorraine said. 32 kids who might not have made it otherwise. Kids who look like Daniel. Kids who deserve a chance. Margaret couldn't speak. Lorraine walked over and stood in front of her. Your husband destroyed my son. Took everything from him. From me. But he spent the rest of his life trying to pay for it. And I don't know if that makes him a good man or a coward. Maybe both. Margaret's shoulders shook with sobs. Lorraine reached out and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I'm sorry your husband carried this alone. But you asked for the truth. And this is it. Margaret looked up at her through her tears. Did you ever forgive him? Lorraine was quiet for a long moment. No, she said finally. But I stopped hating him. That's the best I could do. Margaret didn't remember leaving the house. Didn't remember getting in her car or starting the engine. She found herself parked on a random street in West Baltimore, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her body racked with sobs. Richard. Her Richard. The man who'd held her on their wedding day. Who'd cried with her when they lost the baby. Who'd made her coffee every morning for 42 years. That man had destroyed someone's life. And he'd never told her. Never. Margaret pulled out her phone with shaking hands and scrolled through her photos. Richard at the beach. Richard at Christmas. Richard smiling in their backyard. She stopped on a photo from last year. His birthday. He was laughing at something she'd said, his eyes crinkled at the corners, his hand reaching for hers. She'd loved that man. She still loved him. But she didn't know him. Margaret sat in the car until the sun started to set, until the streetlights flickered on, until her tears finally ran dry. Then she drove home. The house was dark when she arrived. She walked inside and went straight to Richard's study, turning on the light. The withdrawal slips were still spread across the desk where she'd left them. She sat down in his chair and looked around the room. The books on the shelves. The framed photo of them on their anniversary. The coffee mug he'd used every morning, still sitting on the corner of the desk. Everything looked the same. But nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret opened the top drawer of the desk, looking for nothing in particular. Just moving. Searching. And then she saw it. An envelope. Cream-colored. Sealed. Her name written on the front in Richard's handwriting. Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Open if you ever find out." Margaret's hands trembled as she picked it up. She stared at it for a long time. Then she broke the seal. Margaret pulled the letter from the envelope. The paper was crisp, expensive, the kind Richard used for important things. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Neat. Precise. Every letter perfectly formed, even though the words themselves must have been torture to write. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then you've found out. I always knew you would, eventually. I'm not sure if I'm relieved or terrified. Maybe both. I need you to know that everything I'm about to tell you is true. And I need you to know that not telling you has been the greatest regret of my life, second only to what I did to Daniel Grant. In November 1984, I was 28 years old and desperate to prove myself. The bank was cutting costs. My boss told me to find reasons to let people go. Make it look justified. Clean house, he said. Get rid of the dead weight. Daniel Grant was 22. He'd been with us 6 months. He was smart, punctual, polite. The customers loved him. But he was new and he was black, and I knew, God help me, I knew that he'd be the easiest one to sacrifice. So I lied. I told my superiors his cash drawer was coming up short. I falsified the reports. I built a case against a man who'd done nothing wrong, and I did it to save 3 other employees and to make myself look decisive. Strong. Management material. They fired him. They arrested him. They destroyed him. And I let it happen. Margaret's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes and kept reading. I told myself it was necessary. That it was just business. That he'd find another job, move on, be fine. But he wasn't fine. I heard he couldn't find work. That his fiancée left him. That he was falling apart. I told myself it wasn't my fault. That he should have been stronger. That life was hard for everyone. And then, in 1991, I heard he'd killed himself. I found out on a Tuesday. I was at the office, reviewing loan applications, and someone mentioned it in passing. You remember that kid we fired back in '84? Grant. Apparently he hung himself last week. They said it like it was nothing. Like he was nothing. And I sat there at my desk, Maggie, and I felt my entire world collapse. I had killed him. Not with my hands, but with my lies. With my ambition. With my cowardice. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, choking back a sob. I went to his mother's house 2 weeks after the funeral. I don't know what I thought would happen. Maybe I thought she'd forgive me. Maybe I thought confession would ease the weight crushing my chest. She screamed at me. Told me to get out of her house. Told me I'd taken her only child, her entire world, and destroyed him for no reason. She was right. I tried to apologize. Tried to explain. But there's no explanation for what I did. No apology big enough. So I started sending money. $500 a week. It was all I could afford at first. We were still paying off the house, still recovering from the miscarriage bills. But I sent it every week, through Claire at the bank, so you wouldn't find out. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't bring Daniel back. But it was the only thing I could think to do. Maggie, I wanted to tell you. God, I wanted to tell you so many times. But how do you tell the person you love most in the world that you're not who they think you are? That you're a coward who destroyed an innocent man to climb a corporate ladder? How do you say that out loud? So I didn't. I carried it. I paid for it. And I lived with it every single day for 40 years. Every Tuesday when I went to that bank, I thought about Daniel. About what he could have been. About the life he should have had. And I thought about you. About how you loved me without knowing what I'd done. About how I didn't deserve you, but I was too selfish to let you go. I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm sorry for lying. I'm sorry for being weak. I'm sorry for making you love a man who didn't deserve it. If you hate me now, I understand. But please know this. Loving you was the only good thing I ever did. Asterisk yours always. Richard Asterisk. Margaret sat in the chair for an hour, maybe more, the letter clutched in her hands. She read it again. And again. Each time hoping the words would change. That she'd misread something. That there'd be some explanation that made sense. But there wasn't. Richard had destroyed a man's life. And then he'd hidden it from her for 4 decades. She thought about all the Tuesdays. All the times he'd kissed her goodbye and driven to that bank to make his secret payment. All the years he'd sat across from her at dinner, smiling, laughing, pretending everything was fine. How had she not known? How had she not seen? Margaret stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She walked out of the study and through the quiet house, past the photos on the walls, pictures of a life that suddenly felt like a lie. She stopped in the bedroom. Richard's side of the closet was still full of his clothes. His shoes lined up neatly. His watch on the nightstand. She picked up the watch and held it in her palm. It was heavy. Expensive. He'd worn it every day for 20 years. She closed her fingers around it. Then she threw it across the room. It hit the wall and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Margaret sank onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered into the empty room. "Why didn't you tell me?" But Richard wasn't there to answer. He'd never answer again. Margaret didn't sleep that night either. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through memories, searching for signs, clues, moments where Richard had seemed guilty or distant or afraid. But there was nothing. He'd been a good husband, attentive, kind, present. He'd just been carrying a dead man's ghost for 40 years. By the time the sun came up, Margaret had made a decision. She got out of bed, showered, dressed, and returned to Richard's study. She gathered every withdrawal slip, every document, every piece of evidence, and put it all in a folder. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. "Chesapeake Trust and Savings, how may I direct your call?" "I need to speak with the CEO, Margaret said. "Tell them it's about Richard Hayes. Tell them it's urgent." There was a pause. "One moment, please." Margaret waited, her heart pounding. A woman's voice came on the line. Confident. Professional. "This is Kendra Brooks, CEO of Chesapeake Trust. How can I help you?" Margaret took a breath. "Ms. Brooks, my name is Margaret Hayes. My husband, Richard Hayes, was a senior vice president with your bank. He passed away 3 weeks ago." "Yes, Mrs. Hayes. We were devastated to hear about Richard's passing. He was a pillar of this institution." "Was he?" Margaret's voice was cold. "Because I've just discovered that in 1984, he falsely accused a young black employee named Daniel Grant of theft. He destroyed that man's career and reputation. Daniel Grant killed himself 7 years later. And my husband spent the next 40 years paying Daniel's mother $500 a week, over $1 million total, in what I assume was guilt money." Silence on the other end of the line. "I have documentation," Margaret continued. "Withdrawal slips. A signed confession. Testimony from Daniel's mother. And I'm prepared to go public with all of it unless you agree to meet with me. Today." Another pause. Then, "I can see you at 2 o'clock this afternoon." "I'll be there," Margaret said. She hung up. For the first time in days, she felt something other than grief. She felt anger. And anger, she realized, was something she could use. What Margaret is about to do will either destroy Richard's legacy, or transform it into something he never imagined. The next part will break your heart and put it back together. Don't go anywhere. Margaret arrived at Chesapeake Trust headquarters at 1:55 p.m. The building was downtown, all glass and steel, nothing like the old marble branch on North Charles Street where Richard had started his career. This was the new face of the bank. Modern, sleek, impersonal. She walked through the lobby, her heels clicking on the polished floor, the folder of evidence tucked under her arm like a weapon. A receptionist directed her to the executive floor. Margaret stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers climb. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls, a 64-year-old black woman in a navy suit, her hair pulled back, her face composed. She looked calm. She didn't feel calm. The elevator doors opened. A young assistant met her immediately. "Mrs. Hayes? Ms. Brooks is ready for you. This way, please." Margaret followed her down a long hallway lined with portraits of past bank presidents, all white men, all staring down with expressions of stern authority. Richard's portrait wasn't there. He'd been a VP, not a president. But she wondered if he'd ever walked this hallway and imagined his face on these walls. The assistant stopped at a large oak door and knocked twice. "Come in," a voice called. The assistant opened the door and stepped aside. Margaret walked into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the inner harbor. The view was stunning. Sailboats, tourists, the glittering water stretching toward the horizon. And behind the desk sat a woman who looked nothing like the executives in those hallway portraits. Kendra Brooks was black, maybe 50, with natural hair cropped close to her head and sharp, intelligent eyes behind frameless glasses. She stood when Margaret entered, coming around the desk with her hand extended. "Mrs. Hayes, thank you for coming." Margaret shook her hand. The grip was firm, professional. "Please, sit." Kendra gestured to a leather chair across from her desk. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "No, thank you." Kendra sat back down, folding her hands on the desk. "I want you to know that I've spent the last few hours looking into what you told me on the phone. I pulled personnel files from 1984. I spoke with Claire Dalton, who confirmed the payments. And I reached out to Morgan State to verify the scholarship fund in Daniel Grant's name." Margaret's heart pounded. And everything you said is true." Kendra's expression was grave. "I'm deeply sorry, Mrs. Hayes, for what happened to Daniel Grant, for what your husband did, and for the fact that this institution allowed it to happen." Margaret wasn't expecting that. She'd prepared for defensiveness. For lawyers. For a fight. Not an apology. Kendra leaned forward. "I need to be transparent with you. I became CEO of Chesapeake Trust 3 years ago. I'm the first black woman to hold this position. And when I took this job, I made a commitment to uncover and address the systemic failures of this institution's past. What happened to Daniel Grant is exactly the kind of injustice I've been trying to root out." "Then why didn't you know about it?" Margaret asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Because it was buried," Kendra said quietly. Richard's confession never made it into official records. The payments were personal, funneled through Claire Dalton as a private transaction. There was no paper trail connecting the bank to Daniel Grant's firing beyond the original termination paperwork, which listed theft as the cause. No investigation. No follow-up. Just a 22-year-old black man erased from the system. Margaret's chest tightened. Kendra opened a folder on her desk and pulled out a photograph. She slid it across to Margaret. It was Daniel. Young, smiling, standing in front of the bank in his suit. "This was his employee photo," Kendra said softly. "Taken his first day on the job. He looks so hopeful, doesn't he?" Margaret stared at the photo, her throat closing. "I found his personnel file," Kendra continued. "His performance reviews were excellent. So you know he was innocent. I know he was accused without evidence and fired without due process. In today's world, that would have been a lawsuit. A scandal. Back then." Kendra shook her head. "Back then it was Tuesday." Margaret closed her eyes. Kendra stood and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor. "Mrs. Hayes, I want to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me. What do you want?" Margaret opened her eyes. "What?" "You have evidence that could destroy your husband's reputation. You have grounds for a lawsuit against this bank. You could go to the press, to civil rights organizations, to social media. You could burn it all down." Kendra turned to face her. "So I need to know. What do you want?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. What did she want? She'd been asking herself that question since she left Lorraine Grant's house. Since she read Richard's letter. Since she realized the man she'd loved for 42 years had been someone she didn't know. "I want justice for Daniel Grant," Margaret said finally. "I want his name cleared. I want people to know he was innocent." "And your husband?" Margaret's hands tightened on the armrest. I want the truth told. All of it. What Richard did. And what he tried to do to make it right. Kendra studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's fair. More than fair. She returned to her desk and pulled out a legal pad, making notes as she spoke. Here's what I propose. First, the bank issues a formal apology to the Grant family and publicly acknowledges that Daniel Grant was wrongfully terminated. Second, we make a significant financial contribution to the scholarship fund in his name. I'm thinking $2 million. Margaret's eyes widened. Third, Kendra continued, we establish an annual award at the bank in Daniel's honor, given to employees who demonstrate integrity and courage. And fourth, we commission an independent review of all terminations from 1980 to 1990 to identify other potential cases of discrimination or wrongful dismissal. Margaret couldn't speak. As for your husband, Kendra said carefully, I think the truth should be told. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that he spent 40 years trying to atone. That doesn't erase what he did. But it matters. How do we do that? Margaret's voice was hoarse. We include it in the public statement. We acknowledge Richard's role in the injustice, but we also note his decades of private restitution. We let people decide for themselves what that means. Margaret looked down at the folder in her lap. At the withdrawal slips. At Richard's confession. Will that be enough? She whispered. Kendra came around the desk and sat in the chair beside Margaret. Enough for what? For Daniel. For his mother. For... Margaret's voice broke. For the 42 years I spent loving a man who carried this secret. Kendra reached out and placed her hand over Margaret's. Mrs. Hayes, nothing will bring Daniel Grant back. Nothing will erase what your husband did. But this. She gestured to the folder. This is more than most people ever get. Acknowledgement. Restitution. Truth. It's not perfect. But it's something. Margaret looked at her, tears streaming down her face. Will you help me tell Lorraine? Daniel's mother? She deserves to hear this from someone, not read about it in the papers. Kendra nodded. I'll come with you. If she'll see me. 2 days later, Margaret and Kendra stood on Lorraine Grant's porch in West Baltimore. Margaret knocked on the green door, her heart racing. Lorraine answered, her expression wary. When she saw Margaret, her eyes softened slightly. When she saw Kendra, confusion flickered across her face. Mrs. Grant, Margaret said quietly. This is Kendra Brooks. She's the CEO of Chesapeake Trust. We'd like to talk to you. If you'll let us. Lorraine looked between them for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and opened the door. They sat in the same living room where Margaret had learned the truth. Lorraine in her rocking chair. Margaret and Kendra on the couch. Kendra spoke first. Mrs. Grant, I want to start by saying I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what the bank did to your son. I'm sorry it took 40 years for anyone in leadership to acknowledge it. And I'm sorry that I'm only here now because Mrs. Hayes had the courage to demand accountability. Lorraine's eyes narrowed. What do you want? I want to make this right, Kendra said. Or as right as it can be. She explained the plan. The apology. The money. The award. The review. Lorraine sat perfectly still through all of it, her face unreadable. When Kendra finished, Lorraine was quiet for a long time. $2 million, she finally said. For the scholarship fund. Yes, ma'am. And you'll clear his name. Publicly. Yes. Lorraine looked at Margaret. And your husband? Margaret swallowed hard. The truth will come out. What he did. And what he tried to do after. Lorraine nodded slowly. She stood and walked to the wall of photographs, stopping in front of the picture of Daniel in his cap and gown. My son wanted to be something, she said quietly. He wanted to matter. He wanted to make me proud. Her voice cracked. And your husband took that from him. I know, Margaret whispered. I'm so sorry. Lorraine turned to face them, tears streaming down her face. But he tried. Didn't he? Your husband. He tried to pay for it. Yes, Margaret said. He did. It wasn't enough. No, it wasn't. Lorraine wiped her eyes. But it was something. She walked back to her chair and sat down heavily. I'll accept your apology, she said to Kendra. And your money. But not for me. For those kids at Morgan State. For the ones who look like Daniel and deserve a chance. Kendra nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Grant. Lorraine looked at Margaret. And you. I don't blame you for what your husband did. But I need you to understand something. Anything, Margaret said. Daniel was a good man. A kind man. He had his whole life ahead of him. And he died thinking he was nothing. Thinking he was a thief. That's what your husband took from him. Not just his career. His dignity. Margaret's chest heaved with sobs. I know. I'm so sorry. Lorraine reached out and took Margaret's hand. I believe you. They sat there together, two women bound by the actions of a man who was gone, holding each other's grief in the small living room on Pressbury Street. Margaret drove home in silence. Kendra had offered to follow her, to make sure she was okay, but Margaret had declined. She needed to be alone. Needed to sit with everything that had just happened. Lorraine had accepted the apology. Accepted the money. But forgiveness. That was something else entirely. I don't blame you for what your husband did. The words echoed in Margaret's head as she pulled into her driveway in Bolton Hill. She sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house she'd shared with Richard for 42 years. It looked the same as it always had. Red brick. White shutters. The front porch where they'd had coffee on summer mornings. But everything was different now. Margaret got out of the car and walked inside. The house was quiet, heavy with the weight of all the things she now knew. She dropped her purse on the hall table and walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, the walls, the picture frames, trying to anchor herself to something solid. She ended up in Richard's study. The letter was still there on the desk where she'd left it, along with the withdrawal slips and the folder of evidence. She picked up the letter and read it again, even though she'd already memorized every word. Loving you was the only good thing I ever did. Margaret's hands trembled. She wanted to be angry, wanted to rage at him for lying to her, for carrying this secret, for making her complicit in a life built on someone else's destruction. But she also wanted to hold him, to tell him it would be okay, to comfort the man she'd loved for 4 decades, even though that man had done something unforgivable. How could both things be true? Margaret sank into Richard's chair and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one she hadn't looked through yet. Inside were more files, personal papers, tax documents, and another envelope. This one wasn't sealed. It was addressed to no one. Just sitting there, as if Richard had written it and then couldn't decide what to do with it. Margaret pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. December 15th, 2023. I saw him today. Not Daniel. I know he's gone. But I saw a young man at the branch, maybe 23, 24, and he looked so much like him it stopped my heart. Same bright eyes. Same hopeful smile. Same way of standing, like the world was full of possibility. I couldn't breathe. I had to excuse myself and sit in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive home. Maggie asked me if I was feeling okay when I got back. I told her I was fine. Just tired. I've been lying to her for 39 years. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I told her. If I sat her down and said, I destroyed a man's life when I was young and stupid and ambitious. And I've been trying to pay for it ever since. Would she leave me? Hate me? Look at me the way Lorraine Grant looks at me when I see her at the scholarship ceremonies, like I'm a ghost she wishes would disappear. Or would she understand? Would she see that I've been carrying this weight alone for so long that I don't know who I am without it? I don't know. And I'm too afraid to find out. Tomorrow is Tuesday. I'll go to the bank. I'll make my payment. I'll come home and kiss Maggie on the forehead and ask her what she wants for dinner. And I'll carry this alone for one more week. Just like I've done for 39 years. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. He'd been so close to telling her. And he'd chosen silence. She folded the paper and put it back in the drawer, then stood and walked to the window. The sun was setting over Baltimore, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful. The kind of sunset Richard would have pointed out to her, pulling her close and saying something about how lucky they were. But Richard wasn't here anymore. And Margaret was left holding all of his secrets. She picked up her phone and dialed her sister in Atlanta. Maggie! Her sister's voice was warm, concerned. You okay? You haven't called in days. I need to tell you something, Margaret said quietly. And I need you to just listen. Don't interrupt. Don't try to fix it. Just listen. Okay, her sister said, her tone shifting immediately. I'm listening. Margaret took a breath. And then she told her everything. She talked for over an hour. Told her sister about the withdrawal slips, about Claire Dalton, about Lorraine Grant and Daniel and the letter and the weight of it all. Her sister stayed silent the entire time, just like Margaret had asked. When Margaret finally finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Oh, Maggie, I'm so sorry." Margaret closed her eyes. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to feel about him. About us. About any of it. Do you still love him?" The question cut through everything. Margaret thought about Richard. About his laugh. About the way he'd hold her hand under the table at restaurants. About the 42 years they'd built together. "Yes," she whispered. "I do. And I hate that I do." "That's okay," her sister said gently. "You're allowed to love him and be angry at him at the same time. You're allowed to grieve what you lost and be furious that he lied to you. It doesn't have to be one or the other." "But how do I move forward?" Margaret's voice broke. "How do I live with this?" "The same way you've lived with everything else," her sister said. "One day at a time. And you don't have to do it alone." Margaret wiped her eyes. "Thank you. Do you want me to come up? I can be there tomorrow." "No. Not yet. I need to finish this first." "Finish what?" Margaret looked at the folder on the desk. "The evidence. The truth. I need to decide what happens next. Richard may be gone, but his story isn't over yet." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything Kendra had proposed. The public apology. The scholarship money. The truth about Richard coming out. It was the right thing to do. But it would change everything. Richard's colleagues would know. His friends. The people at church. Everyone would know what he'd done. His legacy, the respected banker, the mentor, the pillar of the community, would be shattered. And Margaret would be the one who shattered it. She thought about Lorraine. About Daniel. About the 32 students who'd gotten scholarships because of Richard's guilt money. About all the people who'd been affected by one lie told 40 years ago. She thought about Richard's letter. "Loving you was the only good thing I ever did." And she realized something. She wasn't just doing this for Daniel, or for Lorraine, or even for Richard. She was doing it for herself. Because she couldn't live with another lie. Couldn't spend the rest of her life protecting a version of Richard that didn't exist. Couldn't be complicit in his silence anymore. The truth had to come out. All of it. Even if it hurt. Even if it destroyed his memory. Even if people judged her for staying with him, for not knowing, for loving a man who'd done something unforgivable. She had to tell the truth. Margaret got out of bed and walked back to the study. She opened Richard's laptop. She knew his password, had always known it, and opened a new document. She started typing. My name is Margaret Hayes. 3 weeks ago, my husband, Richard Hayes, passed away. We were married for 42 years. 2 days after his funeral, I discovered that he had been keeping a secret. A terrible secret. One that destroyed a young man's life and haunted Richard for 4 decades. This is that story. Margaret wrote through the night. She wrote about Daniel Grant, about the false accusations, about the suicide, about the 40 years of payments and the scholarship fund and Lorraine's grief that would never fully heal. She wrote about Richard's confession, about his guilt, about his cowardice and his attempts at atonement. She wrote about her own shock, her anger, her heartbreak, about learning that the man she'd loved was capable of something so cruel, about grappling with the fact that love and complicity could exist in the same space. And she wrote about what needed to happen next. By the time the sun came up, she had a 10-page document. A full accounting. The truth, laid bare. Margaret read it over once, twice, 3 times. Then she saved it and closed the laptop. She picked up her phone and called Kendra Brooks. Mrs. Hayes. Kendra's voice was groggy. It was 6:47 a.m. I'm ready, Margaret said. I'm ready to tell the story. All of it. There was a pause. Then, are you sure? Yes. Okay, Kendra said, her voice clearing. Let's do it right. Would you have the courage to tell a truth that would destroy everything you thought you knew? Drop your answer below, because what Margaret does next will define the rest of her life. Kendra Brooks arrived at Margaret's house 2 hours later. She came alone, no assistants, no lawyers. Just her, a leather briefcase, and 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street. Margaret let her in and they sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Margaret and Richard had eaten breakfast together for 42 years. Kendra set one of the coffees in front of Margaret and opened her briefcase. I've been up since you called. Talked to our communications team, our legal department, and the board. They're all on board with what we discussed. But before we move forward, I need to make sure you understand what this means. Margaret wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. I'm listening. When this story goes public, and it will go public, there will be backlash. Against the bank, yes. But also against Richard. People will call him a racist, a liar, a coward. They'll question everything he ever did, every decision he ever made. His reputation will be destroyed. I know. And people will question you too, Kendra continued gently. They'll ask how you didn't know. How you could have stayed married to him if you did know. They'll pick apart your entire life looking for signs that you were complicit. Margaret's jaw tightened. Let them. Kendra studied her for a moment. You're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. Margaret's voice was steady now. Richard spent 40 years hiding the truth. I won't spend another day doing the same thing. Kendra nodded. She pulled a document from her briefcase and slid it across the table. This is the public statement we're proposing. I want you to read it. If there's anything you want changed, anything you want added or removed, just say so. Margaret put on her reading glasses and picked up the document. Chesapeake Trust and Savings. Public statement regarding Daniel Grant. In November 1984, Daniel Grant, a 22-year-old employee of Chesapeake Trust, was wrongfully accused of theft by then-manager Richard Hayes. Mr. Grant was terminated and subsequently arrested based on false allegations. No evidence of theft ever existed. The accusations were fabricated to justify cost-cutting measures during a period of financial pressure. Mr. Grant's termination destroyed his career, his reputation, and ultimately contributed to his death by suicide in 1991. Chesapeake Trust accepts full institutional responsibility for this injustice. We failed Daniel Grant. We failed his family. And we failed to uphold the values of integrity and fairness that should define any financial institution. We have learned that Richard Hayes, who passed away in March 2024, privately attempted to make restitution through regular payments to Mr. Grant's mother, Lorraine Grant, over a period of 40 years. These payments funded a scholarship program that has supported 32 students at Morgan State University. While Mr. Hayes's private efforts do not erase the harm he caused, they reflect a lifetime of remorse. Effective immediately, Chesapeake Trust will 1. Issue a formal apology to the Grant family. 2. Contribute $2 million to the Daniel Grant Memorial Scholarship Fund. 3. Establish the Daniel Grant Award for Integrity, given annually to bank employees who demonstrate moral courage. 4. Commission an independent review of all employee terminations from 1980 to 1990 to identify other potential cases of discrimination or wrongful dismissal. 5. Implement mandatory anti-bias training for all management staff. We cannot undo the past, but we can commit to doing better in the future. This statement is issued with the full support of Margaret Hayes, widow of Richard Hayes, and Lorraine Grant, mother of Daniel Grant. Margaret read it 3 times. Her hands were shaking by the time she finished. "It's perfect," she whispered. Kendra leaned forward. "There's one more thing. I'd like to hold a press conference. Let you speak, if you're willing. Let Lorraine speak, if she's willing. Give Daniel Grant a face and a voice, not just a name in a press release." Margaret's heart raced. "When?" "Next Monday. That gives us time to coordinate with Lorraine, to prepare talking points, to make sure everyone's ready." Kendra paused. "But Mrs. Hayes, you need to know, once we do this, there's no taking it back. The story will be everywhere. Local news, national news, social media. Your life will change." Margaret thought about Richard, about the letter he'd written, about the 40 years he'd spent carrying his secret alone. She thought about Daniel, about the photograph of him smiling in front of the bank, full of hope and possibility. She thought about Lorraine, about the scholarship students, about the truth that needed to be told. "I'm ready," Margaret said. "Let's do it." That afternoon, Margaret and Kendra drove to West Baltimore together. Lorraine answered the door on the second knock. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. When she saw them, she stepped aside without a word. They sat in the living room again, under the watchful gaze of Daniel's photographs. Kendra explained the plan. The press conference. The public statement. The opportunity for Lorraine to speak, to tell the world who her son really was. Lorraine listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap. When Kendra finished, Lorraine looked at Margaret. "Why are you doing this? You could protect your husband's name. Keep this quiet. Nobody has to know." Margaret's throat tightened. "Because it's the truth. And Daniel deserves the truth. Even if it destroys your husband's legacy?" "Even then." Lorraine's eyes filled with tears. "You loved him. I can see that. You really loved him." "I did," Margaret said quietly. "I still do. But I can't love him more than I love the truth." Lorraine reached for a tissue on the side table and dabbed her eyes. "My son was 22 years old when your husband took everything from him. He was just a baby. My baby." Her voice cracked. "And for 33 years, nobody cared. Nobody asked what happened to him. He was just another black boy who didn't make it." "I care," Margaret said. "And I'm asking now." Lorraine looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I'll do it. I'll speak at your press conference. But not for your husband. Not for you. For Daniel. So people know he was real. He mattered. He was somebody." Kendra pulled out another document. "Mrs. Grant, this is the statement we're proposing. I want you to read it and tell me if there's anything you want changed." Lorraine put on her glasses and read slowly, her lips moving slightly as she processed each word. When she finished, she set the paper down and looked up at the photograph of Daniel in his cap and gown. "My son wanted to make me proud," she said softly. "He wanted to be somebody important. Do something meaningful." She turned to Margaret and Kendra. Maybe this is how he finally does. The next 5 days passed in a blur. Kendra's communications team drafted talking points, scheduled interviews, coordinated with local news stations and national outlets. The story was too big to contain. The bank knew that. So they decided to control the narrative as much as possible. Margaret spent hours with a media consultant, practicing her statement, learning how to stay composed when reporters asked invasive questions, how to honor Richard's memory while acknowledging what he'd done. It was exhausting. On Sunday afternoon, Margaret sat in Richard's study, going over her notes one more time. Tomorrow morning, the world would know. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. Her phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "I saw the news alert. Press conference tomorrow? Maggie, what's happening?" Margaret stared at the message. She hadn't told Diane yet. Hadn't told anyone except her sister. She'd been too afraid. Too ashamed. She typed back, "I'll explain everything after tomorrow. I promise." Diane's response came immediately. "Whatever it is, I'm here. I love you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too." She set the phone down and looked around the study. At the books Richard had collected. At the photographs on the walls. At the empty chair where he used to sit. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope you'd understand." The house was silent. But somehow, Margaret felt lighter. Like she'd been carrying a weight she didn't know was there, and now, finally, she was setting it down. Tomorrow the truth would come out. And Margaret would be free. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. Margaret dressed carefully, a black suit, pearls, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wanted to look dignified, strong, like a woman who knew what she was doing, even though her hands were shaking as she applied her lipstick. Kendra picked her up at 8:30 a.m. They drove to the bank's headquarters in silence, neither of them quite ready to speak. When they arrived, the parking lot was already full of news vans, cameras, reporters with microphones, a crowd of people holding signs, some supporting the bank, some calling for accountability, some with Daniel Grant's name written in bold letters. Margaret's stomach churned. "You okay?" Kendra asked. "No," Margaret admitted. "But I'm ready." They walked through the back entrance to avoid the crowd. Inside, the conference room was set up with a podium, a backdrop with the bank's logo, and rows of chairs filled with reporters, bank employees, and community members. Margaret saw Lorraine sitting in the front row, wearing a navy dress and holding a photograph of Daniel. Their eyes met. Lorraine nodded. Margaret nodded back. Kendra stepped up to the podium. "Good morning. Thank you all for coming. We have an important announcement to make today, and we appreciate your patience as we share this difficult story." She read the prepared statement, her voice clear and unwavering. The room was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratching of pens on paper. When Kendra finished, she gestured to Margaret. "I'd now like to invite Margaret Hayes to speak." Margaret stood on legs that felt like water. She walked to the podium, gripping the edges to steady herself. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the cameras pointed at her, at Lorraine in the front row, holding her son's photograph. And she began to speak. Margaret's voice was steady when she spoke, even though her heart was racing. "My name is Margaret Hayes. 3 weeks ago, I lost my husband of 42 years. His name was Richard Hayes, and I thought I knew everything about him." She paused, looking down at her notes, then decided to abandon them. This needed to come from her heart, not from a script. Richard was kind. He was patient. He made me laugh. He held my hand through the hardest moments of my life. He was my best friend. Her voice cracked slightly. And he was also a man who destroyed another person's life. The room was utterly silent. In 1984, my husband falsely accused a young black man named Daniel Grant of theft. Daniel was 22 years old. He just graduated from Morgan State University with honors. He had his whole life ahead of him. Margaret's hands gripped the podium tighter. Richard lied. He fabricated evidence. He destroyed Daniel's career and reputation to save his own position during a cost-cutting period. And Daniel never recovered. She looked directly at Lorraine. Daniel Grant took his own life in 1991. He was 29 years old. A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Margaret continued. For 40 years, my husband carried that guilt. He made weekly payments to Daniel's mother, Mrs. Lorraine Grant, totaling over $1 million. That money funded scholarships for 32 students at Morgan State. But it didn't bring Daniel back. It didn't undo the harm. And Richard knew that. She pulled Richard's letter from her pocket, the one he'd written to her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. My husband left me a confession. In it, he wrote, I had killed him. Not with my hands, but with my lies. With my ambition. With my cowardice. Margaret looked up, tears streaming down her face. Richard spent the rest of his life trying to pay for what he'd done. But he did it in silence. He did it in shame. And he never gave Daniel Grant the one thing he deserved, the truth. She folded the letter and set it on the podium. I'm here today to give Daniel that truth. To say his name. To tell the world that he was innocent. That he was brilliant and kind and full of potential. And that he was failed. By my husband, by this bank, and by a system that allowed a young black man to be erased without question. Margaret's voice grew stronger. I loved my husband. I still love him. But love doesn't mean protecting lies. Love doesn't mean letting injustice stay buried. So today, I'm standing here, telling you the truth. All of it. Because Daniel Grant deserves to be remembered. And because my husband's guilt should never have been mine to carry alone. She stepped back from the podium. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. But Margaret didn't hear any of it. She walked straight to Lorraine. The older woman stood, still clutching Daniel's photograph. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two women bound by one man's sin and another man's silence. Then Lorraine pulled Margaret into an embrace. Thank you, Lorraine whispered against her shoulder. Thank you for giving him back his name. Margaret held her tight, both of them crying now, both of them grieving for different reasons but sharing the same pain. When they finally pulled apart, Kendra stepped to the podium. Mrs. Lorraine Grant has agreed to speak. Please. Lorraine walked slowly to the podium, setting Daniel's photograph on the stand where everyone could see it. She looked out at the crowd, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. This is my son, Daniel Marcus Grant, she said, her voice clear and strong. He was born on Valentine's Day, 1962. He loved basketball. He loved music. He loved making people laugh. Her voice softened. And he loved learning. Education was everything to him. He worked 2 jobs to help pay for college. He graduated top of his class. He was so proud when he got that job at the bank. Lorraine touched the photograph gently. When they accused him of stealing, it broke something in him. He kept saying, Mama, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. And I believed him. I always believed him. Her voice hardened. But nobody else did. Because he was young and black and didn't have power. And Richard Hayes did. She looked directly at the cameras. My son died thinking he was nothing. Thinking he was a thief. For 33 years, I've carried that pain. The pain of knowing that the last thing my baby believed about himself was a lie. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. Today, the truth comes out. Today, my son gets his name back. And today, I want every young black person watching to know, you are not disposable. Your life matters. Your dignity matters. And if the system tries to erase you, there will be people who fight to bring you back. Lorraine picked up the photograph and held it to her chest. Daniel, baby, the whole world knows now. They know you were innocent. They know you mattered. And they know your name. She stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause. The press conference lasted another hour. Reporters asked questions. Kendra outlined the bank's commitments. Community leaders spoke about systemic racism in corporate America. But Margaret barely heard any of it. She sat beside Lorraine in the front row, holding the older woman's hand, both of them exhausted and emotionally spent. When it finally ended, Kendra escorted them out through the back entrance, away from the cameras and reporters still clamoring for more. They stood in a quiet hallway, just the three of them. What happens now? Margaret asked quietly. Kendra exhaled. Now. The bank follows through. We fund the scholarship. We create the award. We do the review. And we make sure Daniel Grant's story isn't forgotten. And Richard. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. His story will be told too, Kendra said gently. People will judge him. Some will see a man who tried to atone. Others will see a coward who should have come forward decades ago. But at least now, it's out in the open. No more secrets. Margaret nodded slowly. Lorraine squeezed her hand. Come on, child. Let me take you home. Your home or mine? Margaret asked, trying to smile through her tears. Yours, Lorraine said firmly. I'm not letting you be alone today. They drove back to Bolton Hill in Lorraine's old sedan, with Kendra following behind in her own car. The three women sat in Margaret's kitchen drinking tea, the same kitchen where Margaret had sat with Richard thousands of times. But it felt different now. Lighter somehow. Kendra's phone kept buzzing with notifications. The stories everywhere, she said, scrolling through news alerts. CNN, MSNBC, local stations. Social media is blowing up. Hashtag Daniel Grant is trending. Lorraine looked at the photograph of her son that she'd set on the table. People are saying his name. Yes, ma'am, Kendra said softly. They are. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from her sister, watching the news. I'm so proud of you. Call me when you can. Then Diane, just saw what you did. Maggie, you're the bravest person I know. More messages flooded in. From church members. Former neighbors. People Margaret hadn't heard from in years, all reaching out with support, with questions, with shock. And some with anger. One message read, how could you destroy your husband's legacy like that? He's barely in the ground. Another, you should be ashamed. Richard was a good man. Margaret stared at the messages, her chest tightening. Lorraine noticed. What is it? People are angry, Margaret said quietly. They think I betrayed Richard. Lorraine reached across the table and took Margaret's phone, setting it face down. Let them be angry. You did the right thing. And deep down they know it. Do they? The ones who matter do, Lorraine said firmly. Kendra stood. I should go. Let you two rest. But Margaret, if you need anything, and I mean anything, you call me. Day or night. Thank you, Margaret said. For everything. After Kendra left, Margaret and Lorraine sat in silence for a while, sipping their tea. Finally, Lorraine spoke. You know what's strange? What? I spent 33 years hating your husband. Couldn't even say his name without feeling sick. But sitting here with you, she paused. I don't hate him anymore. I'm still angry. Still hurt. But the hate is gone. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. How? Because you gave me something I never thought I'd have, Lorraine said. Justice. Not perfect justice. Not the kind that brings my baby back. But justice nonetheless. She looked at Margaret. And you sacrificed your husband's memory to give me that. That takes courage. I didn't do it just for you, Margaret admitted. I did it for me too. I couldn't live with the lie anymore. That's okay, Lorraine said. Doing the right thing for selfish reasons is still doing the right thing. They sat together until the sun began to set. Two women who'd been strangers a week ago, now bound by truth and grief and something that felt almost like friendship. That night, alone in her house, Margaret walked through the rooms one more time. She stopped in Richard's study and looked at his chair, his books, his empty coffee mug. I don't know if you'd be proud of me or ashamed of me, she said to the empty room. But I hope wherever you are, you finally have peace. Real peace. Not the kind you try to buy with guilt money, but the kind that comes from the truth being known. She picked up the photograph from their wedding day, the one Richard had shown Lorraine all those years ago. They looked so young, so happy, so full of hope. I still love you, Margaret whispered. Even knowing what I know. Even after everything. I still love you. She set the photo back down and turned off the light. Tomorrow, the media circus would continue. There would be more interviews, more questions, more judgment. But tonight, Margaret slept. For the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, dreamlessly, peacefully. Because the truth was finally out. And she was finally free. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the auditorium at Morgan State University, watching students file in for the Daniel Grant Memorial Scholarship Ceremony. The room was packed. Faculty members, students, community leaders. And in the front row, Lorraine Grant, wearing her Sunday best and holding a program with her son's face on the cover. Margaret smoothed down her dress, a deep purple, Lorraine's favorite color, and took a deep breath. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind. The story had dominated headlines for weeks. Bank executive's widow exposes husband's 40-year cover-up. Justice for Daniel Grant after 33 years. Asterisk atonement or cowardice. The complicated legacy of Richard Hayes. Asterisk. The response had been exactly what Kendra predicted. Split down the middle. Some people praised Margaret for her courage. Called her a truth-teller. A woman of integrity. Others crucified her. Said she betrayed her husband's memory. That she was selfish. Attention-seeking. That Richard's private atonement should have stayed private. The people at church had been the hardest. Half of them stopped speaking to her. The other half treated her like fragile glass, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact. Margaret had stopped going after the 4th week. But she'd also received hundreds of letters, emails, messages from strangers who'd experienced similar injustices. From families who'd lost loved ones to false accusations. From people who said Daniel's story gave them hope that truth could still matter. One letter came from a young black man in Chicago who wrote, Asterisk, my brother was accused of something he didn't do 3 years ago. He's still fighting to clear his name. Seeing what you did for Daniel Grant gave my family hope. Thank you for not staying silent. Asterisk. That letter was taped to Margaret's refrigerator. She read it every morning. Now, standing in this auditorium, watching these students, Daniel's legacy, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. The ceremony began. The university president spoke about the scholarship fund's history. How it had started with Richard's anonymous payments. How it had grown over the years. And how Chesapeake Trust's $2 million contribution had secured its future for generations. Then Kendra Brooks took the stage. The Daniel Grant Award for Integrity was created to honor a young man who never got the chance to fulfill his potential, Kendra said, her voice carrying through the auditorium. But through this scholarship, Daniel's legacy lives on. In every student who sits here today. In every graduate who goes on to do great things. Daniel Grant is still making a difference. The audience applauded. Kendra continued. This year, we're awarding 12 scholarships. 12 students who demonstrate academic excellence, financial need, and a commitment to integrity." She smiled. "I'd like to invite this year's recipients to the stage." One by one, 12 students walked up. Young black men and women, dressed in their best clothes, their faces glowing with pride and possibility. Margaret watched them, her eyes blurring with tears. This was what Richard had been paying for. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but this. These young people, these futures. After the students received their awards, Lorraine was invited to speak. She walked slowly to the podium, leaning on her cane. At 78, she moved more carefully now. But her voice was as strong as ever. 43 years ago, I gave birth to a son who changed my life, Lorraine began. He was my heart, my pride, my everything. She looked out at the students. And when he died, I thought that was the end. That his life had been wasted. That he'd be forgotten. She paused, her hand trembling slightly on the podium. But he wasn't forgotten. Because of these scholarships, my Daniel's name lives on. Because of your studies, your success, your futures, he matters. He still matters. Lorraine's voice grew stronger. To the 12 young people receiving scholarships today, I want you to know something. My son wanted what you have. A chance. An education. An opportunity to be somebody. He didn't get to finish his journey. But you will finish yours. And when you do, you'll be carrying a piece of Daniel with you. She looked directly at the students. Make him proud. Make yourselves proud. And never let anyone tell you that you don't belong or that you don't matter. Because you do. Daniel knew it. And I know it. The audience rose to their feet, applauding. Margaret stood too, tears streaming freely down her face. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the student center. Margaret stood near the refreshment table, watching Lorraine surrounded by scholarship recipients, all of them asking her questions about Daniel, thanking her, hugging her. She's something, isn't she? Margaret turned. A young woman stood beside her, maybe 20, with natural hair pulled back in a ponytail and intelligent eyes behind black-rimmed glasses. Yes, she is, Margaret said. I'm Jasmine, the woman said, extending her hand. I received the scholarship last year. Senior now, majoring in finance. Margaret shook her hand. Margaret Hayes. Jasmine's eyes widened. I know who you are. You're the reason we're all here. The reason the truth came out. Margaret shook her head. Lorraine is the reason. And Daniel. Maybe, Jasmine said. But you're the one who had the courage to tell the story. Even when it hurt. She paused. My mom read about what you did. She said you reminded her that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, but it's still right. Margaret's throat tightened. Your mom sounds wise. She is. Jasmine smiled. I just wanted to say thank you. Because of Daniel's scholarship, I'm the first person in my family going to college. And after I graduate, I'm going to work in banking. I want to be the kind of person who stands up when things aren't right. Like you did. Before Margaret could respond, Jasmine hugged her, quick and fierce, then disappeared back into the crowd. Margaret stood there, blinking back tears, when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Lorraine. Come on, the older woman said. There's something I want to show you. Lorraine led Margaret outside, across the campus quad to a small garden area Margaret hadn't noticed before. In the center was a bronze plaque mounted on a stone pedestal. In memory of Daniel Marcus Grant. 1962 to 1991. He wanted to be somebody. Through these scholarships, he is. Margaret's breath caught. The university installed it last month, Lorraine said quietly. Kendra helped coordinate it. She said every scholarship recipient should know whose shoulders they're standing on. Margaret read the inscription again, her vision blurring. It's perfect. Lorraine reached out and touched the plaque gently, the way she used to touch Daniel's photographs. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "Your husband took my son away from me. But in a strange way, he gave him back too." Lorraine looked at Margaret. Those 40 years of payments kept Daniel's name alive. Gave him a legacy. It doesn't make up for what was taken. But it's something. "Do you think Daniel would have forgiven Richard?" Margaret asked quietly. Lorraine was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Maybe. Daniel had a big heart. Bigger than mine." She turned to Margaret. "But I think the better question is, have you forgiven him?" Margaret thought about Richard. About the letter. About the 40 years he spent carrying his guilt. About the man she'd loved and the man he'd actually been. "I'm working on it," she said honestly. "Some days I'm angry. Some days I'm heartbroken. Some days I just miss him so much I can't breathe." She paused. "But I'm also grateful. Because he led me to you. To Daniel's story. To the truth. And I think that matters." Lorraine nodded slowly. "That's good enough." They stood together in front of the memorial as the sun began to set over the campus, casting long shadows across the garden. Two women. Two different stories. One shared truth. 6 months after the press conference, Margaret received a letter from Chesapeake Trust. Inside was a formal invitation to the first annual Daniel Grant Award for Integrity ceremony at the bank. And a personal note from Kendra. "Margaret, we'd be honored if you'd present this year's award. The recipient is a young loan officer who reported discriminatory lending practices in her department, even though it put her career at risk. She reminds me of you, someone who chose truth over comfort. I hope you'll consider it. With gratitude, Kendra." Margaret stood in her kitchen, holding the letter, thinking about everything that had happened. She thought about Richard's empty chair. About Lorraine's garden memorial. About Jasmine and the other scholarship recipients. About the truth that had finally been told. She picked up her phone and texted Kendra, "I'd be honored." Then she called Lorraine. "The bank wants me to present an award," Margaret said when Lorraine answered. "An award named after Daniel. Would you come with me?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Yes, child. I'll be there." 1 year after Richard's death, Margaret sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she discovered the withdrawal slips, where she'd read Richard's confession, where she'd begun this journey. The house still felt too big, too quiet, but it didn't feel haunted anymore. Margaret had packed up most of Richard's things, donated his clothes, given his books to the library, but she'd kept a few items. His wedding ring, the photograph from their anniversary, and the letter he'd written to her. She kept the letter in a small box on her nightstand. Sometimes she read it, sometimes she didn't, but knowing it was there helped somehow. She'd made peace with the fact that she could love Richard and be angry at him at the same time. That she could grieve the man he was while acknowledging the harm he'd caused. That love didn't have to be simple or clean or without complications. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lorraine. "Dinner Sunday? I'm making pot roast." Margaret smiled and texted back, "I'll bring dessert." Over the past year, she and Lorraine had become close. Not just connected by tragedy, but genuinely friends. They had dinner together most weeks. Attended church together. A different church than the one Margaret had left. Visited Daniel's memorial on campus. It was strange how truth and pain could create bonds that felt almost like family. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Baltimore skyline. The city where she'd built a life with Richard. The city where Daniel had lost his. The city where both their stories had finally been told. She thought about the scholarship students. About the bank's ongoing review of past terminations. About the other stories of injustice that were starting to surface now that people felt safe speaking up. Richard's confession had opened a door. and people were walking through it. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened her photos. She scrolled to a picture from last month's scholarship ceremony. Lorraine surrounded by students, all of them smiling. And in the corner, barely visible, Margaret herself, standing quietly, watching the legacy of truth unfold. She stared at the photo for a long moment. Then she whispered to the empty kitchen, "You were wrong about one thing, Richard. Loving me wasn't the only good thing you did. This," she gestured to the photo, to the memory of the students, to everything that had come from his confession. "This is good too. It's not enough. It doesn't erase what you did. But it's something." The house was quiet. But somehow, Margaret felt Richard there. Not haunting, just present. The way love always is, even after someone's gone. She set her phone down and started preparing dinner. Lorraine was coming over. They were going to plan the next scholarship fundraiser. Talk about Daniel. Talk about Richard. Talk about the messy, complicated truth of loving people who've done unforgivable things. And as Margaret moved through her kitchen, she realized something. She was going to be okay. Not today. Not tomorrow. But eventually. Because the truth, however painful, had set her free. And Daniel Grant's name would be remembered. Not as a thief. Not as a tragedy. But as a young man who deserved better. Who got justice, even if it came 33 years too late. And that, Margaret thought, was something worth living for. Margaret Hayes stood at Lorraine Grant's side at the next scholarship ceremony. As they watched 12 more students receive Daniel's scholarship, Margaret thought about secrets and truth, about love and justice, about the weight we carry and the legacies we leave behind. Richard had spent 40 years trying to pay for his sin in silence. But it was only when the silence broke, when the truth came into the light, that healing could begin. Not perfect healing. Not complete healing. But something. And sometimes, Margaret had learned, something is enough. Some secrets don't die with the people who keep them. They live on in the hearts of the ones left behind, waiting for someone brave enough to speak them into the light. Margaret Hayes became that person. And in doing so, she gave Daniel Grant something he'd been denied for 33 years. His name, his dignity, and his truth. If this story touched you, if it made you think about the secrets we keep and the truths we owe, leave a comment below. What would you do in Margaret's position? Would you protect the memory, or speak the truth? Sometimes the hardest decisions reveal who we really are.